This guy's really interesting. As you can, well, let me back up. As you can see here, what we're doing is going through basically psychology, which is not my field, but I can put together enough to help us talk about it. And I didn't know a lot about this guy. Really interesting guy, 1927, 1987, University of Chicago and Harvard, but he was a member of the Haganah, and that was a Jewish paramilitary organization in the British Mandate of Palestine, 1921 to 1948. This becomes the core of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Maybe that's not a good thing to be associated with these days, or this week. He was captured by the British and held at an internment camp on Cyprus. So this, I mean, look at him. He's a nice psychology professor. Except he escaped from the internment camp. He's basically a spy. And was in Palestine during the fighting in 1948 to establish a Jewish state. Remember, that's when the Jewish state was established. And before that, British held Palestine. He refused to participate in the nonviolent forms of activism there. Lived in a kibbutz and returned to America in 1948. That's when he enrolled at the University of Chicago. In 1948, you could gain your degree by taking an examination, or a series of examinations. He took them and graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1 year, simply by demonstrating what he knew. Really interesting guy. He based his work on Jean Piaget, and if you've ever been in education in any way, you know this name, right? Most educational theory and practice is based on Piaget, and why not? He's a sweet-looking guy, isn't he? Nice little beret there. Director of the International Bureau of Education, he declared in 1934 that only education is capable of saving our societies from possible collapse, whether violent or gradual. He was employed at the Binet Institute in the 1920s, and his job, this is interesting too, was to develop French versions of the questions on English intelligence tests. Okay, so he's got to develop the French version of the English intelligence test. And that got him interested in how children learn. He was especially interested in why they gave the wrong answers, which wrong answers tell you a lot more sometimes than right answers. And he thought he could base a theory on why they got those answers wrong. And so he's really the first psychologist. Now, of course, philosophers have been doing cognitive development for millennia, since the pre-Socratics, and even in some other cultures. But he was the first psychologist to focus on cognitive development, how we know, how we come to know what we know. And I'll talk about in the next slide his stage theory of cognitive development. And so I find this really interesting and even ingenious, is that we, even today, are so obsessed with standardized testing and what students know. He was interested in what students think, so and even children, especially children. And he wanted to know not that they could do arithmetic, but how they processed numerical thinking, mathematical thinking. He was interested in the process, not the product. And for him, most people just assumed that children were undeveloped adults. But he showed, and I'll show you here, that there's actually a pretty clear developmental process in cognitive thinking from the beginning of our lives. So he called it genetic epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word that means how we know. How do we know? It's a whole branch of philosophy about the nature of knowledge and how we acquire it, or if we acquire it. So there's the stages, little steps going up, and the first is the sensoromotor stage. You can see 0 to 2 years. This is basically about object permanence. You know what that is, right? When you can no longer fake out a kid by making the ball disappear. It's like, no, I know the ball's still there. Can't say that usually, but knows it's there. And so the child can form what he called a schema, a mental representation of the object that's not there. Pre-operational, 2 to 6 years. During this stage, children can think about things symbolically. They can make a word or an object stand in for something else, right? Other than itself. This is huge. This is a huge development. Thinking is the basis of language, of course. At this stage, however, it's still egocentric. The child cannot imaginatively put himself into another person, cannot see the world from another person's view. Concrete operational 7 to 12 years. Piaget considered the concrete stage a major turning point in the development because here begins logical thought. The child can work out things internally in his or her head. Rather than moving things around, the child can sit and think through those issues. You ever seen this in a child? It's kind of amazing to watch. They're like thinking. Instead of moving the things on the ground, they're moving them in their head. This is things like number, mass, and weight become abstract for the child, as well as concrete. And then finally, formal operational, which is, as you can see, 12 years to adult. People develop the ability to think about abstract concepts, to logically test hypotheses, you and I on a good day. All right, why are we talking about Piaget? Because you can't have Kohlberg without Piaget. What Kohlberg does is he looked at Piaget's work and said, I'm not sure it's about cognition because knowing things is one thing and behavior is another, and the knowing and the behavior aren't necessarily connected. What I find connected is morality and behavior. In fact, that's how we judge morality, is through behavior. So he replaces Piaget's notion of cognition, or maybe supplements is a better word, with morality or ethics, and then he expands the stages, as I'll show you. So moral reasoning, which is a kind of reasoning, it's a kind of philosophical thinking, but it's certainly not epistemology, it's not cognition. The integration of ethics into the paradigm, and this was his 1958 dissertation. Of course, this too adds to the Piaget synthesis, along with Dewey and some other philosophers like Mead, to produce educational theory as it exists today, pretty much. All right, Charlie, I've been behind on my puns, so let me see if I can catch up. Been holding that one all day. The Heinz dilemma. This is Mr. Heinz, but of course someone thought of a different kind of dilemma when you ran out of ketchup. A woman was on her deathbed. There was one drug the doctors thought might save her. It was a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The drug was expensive to make, but the druggist was charging 10 times what the drug cost him to produce. This isn't exactly theoretical, is it? He paid $200 for the radium, the druggist, and charged $2,000 for a small dose. The sick woman's husband, Mr. Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could only get together about $1,000, which is half the cost of the dosage. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or to let him pay later. But the druggist says, nope, I discovered the drug and I'm going to make money from it. So Heinz got desperate and broke into the man's laboratory to steal the drug for his wife. Should Heinz have broken into the laboratory to still the drug, why or why not? This is the Heinz dilemma. This is what Kohlberg used to test his subjects. So you're going to see here the stages. I mean, there they are. I'm going to go into them in more depth in a minute. Stage one of our moral development, according to Kohlberg, is simple obedience. Now, the important thing to realize with Kohlberg's theory is that it is not about particular outcomes. It is not about particular ethical choices. It is about the kind of ethical reasoning that occurs here. Right? So you can get different outcomes, different behavioral outcomes. What he's concerned with is the moral reasoning. So, for example, at stage one, Heinz should not steal the medicine because he'll consequently be put into prison, which means he's a bad person. Or Heinz should steal the medicine because it's only worth $200 and not how much the druggist wanted for it. Heinz had even offered to pay for it and was not stealing anything else. So again, that's two examples of that kind of reasoning in stage one. Wildly different outcomes, but the same kind of reasoning. Stage two, self-interest. Heinz should steal the medicine because he'll be much happier if he saves his wife, even if he's in prison. Heinz should not steal the medicine because prison is terrible, and he would more likely languish in a jail cell than over his wife's death. So, again, different outcomes, same type of reasoning, self-interest. Conformity. Heinz should steal the medicine because his wife expects it, and he wants to be a good husband. I see Sharon looking at David right now. Heinz should not steal the drug because stealing is bad and he's not a criminal. He's tried to do everything he can without breaking the law, and you cannot blame him. Conformity. Stage four, law and order. Heinz should not steal the medicine. Why? Because the law prohibits it. It's illegal. Or Heinz should steal the drug for his wife, but also take the punishment for the crime, as well as paying the druggist. Criminals cannot just run around without regard for the law. Actions have social, judicial consequences. Same type of reasoning, different behavior. Human rights. If you're seeing that these are hierarchical, you're right. Heinz should steal the medicine because everyone has a right to choose life, regardless of the law. That right is above the law. Or Heinz should not steal the medicine because the scientist who developed the drug has a right to fair compensation. Even if his wife is sick, it does not make his actions right. Stage 6, universal human ethics. If that sounds like Immanuel Kant, good for you. Heinz should steal the medicine because saving a human life is a more fundamental value than the property rights of another person. We're in a different level now, right? Or Heinz should not steal the medicine because others may need the medicine just as badly, and their lives are equally significant. Okay, that's a quick overview. Here's a less quick overview. So, for Kohlberg, the 6 stages are divided into 3 levels, 2 stages per level. All right. Basically, we're talking about pre-conventional morality, and I think these are strange schema and jargon, but I think we know what it's talking about. We're talking about children who don't really follow ethical laws or codes. Pre-conventional. Conventional, okay, this is what you should do, this is what you were taught to do, or not to do, and you should just do that or not do that, because that's what you've been told. Conventional morality. Or post-conventional morality, where you see beyond the limitations of the moral systems, the ethical systems. Is any of this sounding familiar? It should, because we're talking with Soren Kierkegaard in the background here. Remember the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage. Except Kohlberg's not going to go to the religious stage. Or maybe he is. Let's see. All right, so the 3 levels I think are pretty simple, and he puts the 2 stages within those levels. Stage 1, again, obedience and punishment, behavior driven by avoiding punishment. If this were Freud, we might be talking about the id, or the development of the ego. Stage 2, individual interest behavior, self-interest and rewards. All right, that's less fear and more reward, but still a very low-level, individual, moral reasoning. If it's reasoning at all, it's simply, I want to feel this, I don't want to feel that. Conventional morality, interpersonal behavior driven by social approval. Most of us live there. Authority, stage 4, behavior driven by obeying authority and conforming to social order. All right, so yeah, we'll get into all this. There's a lot to say here. And then finally, post-conventional morality, social contract behavior driven by balance of social order and individual rights. We got into this some when we talked about Hobbes a few series ago. And then stage 6, universal ethics, behavior driven by internal moral principles. So stage 1 for Kohlberg is from about age 2 or 3 to 5 or 6. Okay, seems about right. Stage 2, age 5 to 7, maybe up to age 9. Stage 3, sometimes called the good boy, nice girl orientation, age 7 to 12. Stage 4, law and order, age 10 to 15. Stage 5, starting as early as age 12 and beyond. Stage 6, actually Kohlberg says most people don't get to stage 6. Reflection. One more other way, just to make sure we're on the same page. At stage 1, children think of what is right as that which authority says is right. And that's usually going to be parents. Doing the right thing is obeying authority and avoiding punishment. At stage 2, children are no longer impressed by any, I like this, they're no longer impressed by any single authority. They see that there are different sides to any issue. Since everything is relative, one is free to pursue one's own interests, although it's important to make deals and exchanges with one another, because that's in your best interest. At stages 3 and 4, young people think of themselves as members of society with its values, norms, and expectations. This sounds like high school to me. There's so many pressures to conform. At stage 4, concern shifts from that more immediate peer pressure, maybe, to obeying laws to maintain society as a whole. At stage 5, we emphasize basic rights, democratic processes. At stage 6, we define principles by which agreement will be most just. And stage 6 is very important because that's a trans-ethical stage. It means you can change the ethics from there. You can't change it from the other stages. In his later work, Kohlberg actually talked about a stage 7, which he called, and we like this, the mystic stage. Now we're talking Kierkegaard again. He sees this as meta-ethical. In this stage, individuals can problematize any action or intention by asking themselves whether it's moral. So it's meta-ethical. All right, what about this theory? Some more about it. First of all, qualitative differences. The stages are qualitatively different, meaning that there's not much overlap. I know, we don't like that. We don't like schema like that. We don't like to be, or maybe I'm just speaking for myself, I I don't like to be trapped in a schema. I want the lines blurred. I want the boxes open, right? But this is not Kohlberg. These are qualitative differences. So he's marked these stages pretty rigid. You can't be in stage 1 and stage 4 at the same time. You just can't. He also talked about structured wholes, meaning that these are not just isolated responses that children and young people have, but are general patterns of thought. Again, I hope you saw that in the discussion of the stages. This is a types of reasoning. The stages constitute types of reasoning, not particular behaviors. And so they're really working from holistic systems that form ethical philosophies, really. All right, invariant sequence. Kohlberg says you must go through these stages, not that you must, but that we do go through these stages in order without variation. He will back this up with a lot of data, a lot of longitudinal studies over time. Children always go from stage 1 to stage 2 and stage 3 and so forth. He did discover what he termed regression, where people regressed back a stage, but you must go through the stages in order. I think there's something American about resisting that. I just don't like that. I don't want to be told that I have to go through something in order. Hierarchic integration. This is really important. And perhaps the most valuable part of this theory is that you do not leave behind the previous stage. You integrate the previous stage into the next stage. So it's like a ladder you're climbing up. You can't get to the top rung without using the bottom rung. You can't move forward in life without going through these stages and using what you learn from it. That resonates, I think, with those of us who come here and talk about these things, is that nothing is wasted, is the implication here, right? And I think that's a good thing. It would be traumatic, I think, if you thought a stage of your life was wasted. For Kohlberg, it's not. It gets integrated and elevated as you go along. And then universal sequence. He says this is the same in all cultures. And again, he has data to back this up. Obviously, it's qualitative data, interviews and such. But for Kohlberg, it's going to happen to everybody, everywhere, everywhere, these stages. Okay. Criticisms of Kohlberg. Well, there are plenty, as you might guess. First of all, lots of critics don't like the notion of a post-conventional morality, especially cognitive theories, because you can't measure it. Right? And it moves toward the mystical, right? So if you've got a post-conventional anything, what are you supposed to do with this? And again, I would call us back to Kierkegaard, who, when you get into the religious stage, all bets are off. You're on your own. There's no pack. It's like J. Krishnamurti wrote, that the flight of the eagle is pathless. So if you want to follow the sacred, if you want to become the fullest human being you can be, Jung would say this too, is that there's no path except your path, which is visible only to you. All right. But that's not a good thing to talk about for social scientists, especially cognitive scientists. Cultural bias. All right, I think this is probably a fair criticism. Some of you know that my studies are in Native American literature and religion, Native American cultures, and I've read a number of stories about, well, they don't call it this typically, but it's basically about this issue of morality in Native American cultures. And I recall a story about a young man who committed suicide in think it was in one of the pueblos, and the tribe came together and wept and mourned for what they did to the young man, or what they didn't do for the young man. So one of the assumptions of Kohlberg's theory is a kind of Cartesian enlightenment self, unconnected to other selves. And that's simply not the way of the world. It may be the way of our world, here in the West and here in America. It's simply not the way of the world for many people who've lived in the world and on the planet. In fact, I would suggest that this is a relatively new phenomenon that is born of individualism that flourishes during the Enlightenment. There's a book came out a few years ago arguing that the notion of the individual was invented in the 17th century. I kind of like that idea. I can see how that's true. Not that there were no individuals before that, of course there were, but that the individual did not see herself as an individual. She saw herself as part of a clan, a family, a tribe, a nation. That's where the identity came from. It's only in the late Western intellectual history that the individual becomes a thing. And I know that it's ingrained itself in us. And there are many advantages to that. There are also some disadvantages, right? And we can talk about that in the discussion, I hope. Gender bias. I'm not going to talk a lot about this for a couple reasons. I think you've probably seen it already as I've gone through the theory. And our next to last talk will be about the woman who critiques Kohlberg and offers a different understanding of moral development based on gender, and that is Carol Gilligan. She was his student. She worked with him at Harvard and saw what he was doing, participated in the research, furthered the research, but said, I'm not sure this holds for little girls in the same way it holds for little boys. And so we'll talk, as I said, about In a Different Voice, Carol Gilligan. And accordingly, she looks at, I'm going to tell you, she looks at it not in terms of moral reasoning, in terms of something like justice at the highest stage, or self-interest at the lower stages. She says little girls and big girls and women look at ethics in terms of care, of survival and care. So that's a little prelude for lecture 9, discussion 9. There's also a sense of ethical optimism in Kohlberg that's perhaps naive. I don't know. So you may have come upon this already as you've thought about it through my talk so far. Isn't this a rather flat, naive may be too strong, or at least not dynamic sense of ethics? For example, how do we resolve, if we're all at stage 6, how do we resolve the issue of, say, abortion? What process of ethical reasoning, what will that produce in terms of abortion, the issue of abortion, or war, or terrorism? Obviously, it hasn't produced a lot, because if you take an ethics course anywhere, anytime, it's probably going to be organized around the dilemmas that we can't solve, like those that I mentioned. So, if this is how we develop, if we develop morally, and that's who we are as people, then we kind of suck, because we can't figure stuff out. So what's the value of an ethical theory, or a theory based on ethical reasoning where we don't go anywhere? Sure, maybe our thinking matures in these ways, but I kept saying, don't look at the outcome, but at some point you have to look at the outcome. What does this kind of thinking produce at each stage, especially at the higher stages? does it help us? Still, I think Kohlberg adds a lot to our understanding of how we become who we are in stages along life's way. First of all, he shifts the focus from Piaget's epistemology to moral reasoning. I think that's a good shift because epistemology is one thing, moral reasoning is quite another. It's much more immediate, right? Moral reasoning is something you do every day whether you want to or not. Do you let the person in who's merging on the freeway? The answer is yes, you always do that. If you don't do that, you're not a good person. I'm just going to state that from my moral reasoning. I always tell students when they're taking philosophy courses with me, a lot of this is going to be abstract, but I never say that with ethics, because ethics is never abstract. It's something, and actually we're going to talk about this in a minute. It's something we do, though it's not always something we think about. We'll see. So I think it's good that the shift occurred from Piaget, if only to supplement Piaget. You know about the trolley problem? Yeah. Anna, or Flanders, standing on the embankment above a train track, watching a train track maintenance team do its work. Suddenly, Flanders hears the sound of a train barreling down the track. Brakes have failed, and the train's heading for the 6 workers. Beside Flanders is a lever. If he pulls it, the train is forced onto a sidetrack and will grind to a halt without harming anyone. Good. No ethical problem, right? Just do that. Suppose Flanders now finds himself in the same situation, and in fact this situation, where there's still Family Guy on the track, but now Homer Simpson is eating a donut on the other track. So the only 2 choices are to kill Homer Simpson or to kill the Family Guy. Now it gets more complicated. And you can add to this. There's been some really interesting writing on the trolley problem of late, especially about how it's too abstract. But anyway, you can do that on your own. Really, Philip Foot, 1967, this problem's been around. It's a classical ethical reasoning or scenario that asks students and you to think about what you would do. And again, it's a Kohlberg approach, not what you would do, but why you would do what you would do. What's the reasoning process? A couple of scholars put this scenario on their website at Harvard, Hauser in particular, and asked people to solve the problem. It's an amazing consensus that was reached, and non-consensus at the same time. 89% of the subjects agree that Homer Simpson must die. Easy, right? Because it's counting. 89%. Now, there's another twist to the trolley problem. Let's add Elmer Fudd to it. And that is, what if, in order to save Family Guy, the family, you have to push someone onto the track? How does that change? Remember, 89% say, yeah, I'm cool with that. Homer can go down. He's having a donut. He'll be happy as he goes. But I'm not going to push Stewie onto the tracks. I'm just not going to do it. I don't care how many lives it saves. It can save 100 lives. I'm not going to push someone onto the track to save those lives. Why not? Well, the study shows that this is true. This is true. 89% will easily sacrifice Homer. No one will sacrifice the person by taking action against the person. No one will do that. women's choices, indistinguishable from men's in this survey. Jews, Muslims, Catholics, teenagers, parents, grandparents, all the same. I'm happy to sacrifice one person through a mechanical device. I am not happy to do it through my own hand. The moral instinct, Hauser and his colleagues conclude, is universal. The expression of that universal instinct, they say, is anything but. Because their justifications, once you ask them why, they know with an uncommon certainty what they would do. They cannot tell you why. They cannot articulate. They cannot give you even a two-sentence argument for why Homer should die, but not a person at their own hand. Less than 1 in 3 could come up with the moral difference between the active choice of pushing someone onto the tracks and the simple throwing of a lever to sacrifice one person to save one. Less than 1/3. What does that say? Well, for me, I think, and some others, I think it means that morality is a lot like language. And here I'm going to borrow from Rebecca Sachs, S-A-X-E, in a piece called Cognitive Science's Search for a Common Morality, because I think she puts it better than I could. But basically, think about morality as a kind of language. And listen to what she says here. We can draw 3 predictions from the theory that morality operates as a language does. First, just as each speaker can produce and understand an infinite number of completely original sentences, every moral reasoner can make fluent, confident, and compelling moral judgments about an infinite number of ethical cases, unique cases, including ones they've never imagined. Second, cross-culturally, systems of moral reasoning can be as diverse as human languages are, without precluding the universal system of rules derived from our biological inheritance that underlies and governs all these surface-level differences. If there are any linguists in the audience, you're hearing Noam Chomsky in the background, his theory of a structural, universal grammar, basically. Finally, just as native speakers are unable to articulate rules of grammar that they obey when speaking, the practitioners of moral judgment may have great difficulty articulating the principles that inform their judgment. All right? Can you articulate the reason why your sentences are formed the way they are? I'll never forget teaching, I'm a literature professor, basically, with some other cool stuff thrown in. I remember teaching my very first English class. It was at a community college, and it was a classic English class where you write a 5-paragraph essay, and you read great writers. So I remember taking the first couple weeks and talking about grammar and syntax, and mechanics and punctuation, and structure of a sentence, and all that. And then we got to the literature part, and we read the brilliant Alice Walker's short story, Everyday Use. And my student says, she isn't doing any of this. You know what? You're right, she's not. And hers is more fun than what we're doing. Right? So I was trying to articulate this grammar behind what they're doing, and that's still very helpful and useful. But the fun part comes with a new grammar, a new syntax, a new way of speaking and thinking and writing. And that's what Alice Walker was doing. And so I retreated and said, well, you have to know the rules to break the rules. But it was a little cheating, a little bit of cheating. All right, so if we think about morality as a language, we might get out of some of these theoretical problems. And being raised in postmodernism and poststructuralism, as I was in my doctoral studies, I like that, because I think well, not the ultimate reality. I think it's the reality we live in. I believe the world is linguistic. We're always trying to get out of the linguistic world, and we can't. And I think morality is fundamentally linguistic. It's about how we talk. But you don't have to listen to me. Let's talk about Phineas Gage. You know Phineas Gage? He's awesome. So, there have been some studies of morality in the brain. I'm never a big fan of these because I'm not a scientist and I'm immediately skeptical. But let's talk about it. Jorge Moll and his colleagues, I believe he's at Princeton, did MRIs on their subjects and measured the blood oxygen levels in the brain while they read different types of sentences. So these are sentences describing moral or social violations. Right? So some of the sentences were, they hung an innocent man. He licked the dirty toilet. And neutral sentences that are nonsensical, stones are made of water. They found that one brain region, the medial orbitofrontal cortex, Carolina, do you know what that is? The region just behind the space between the eyebrows had a higher oxygenation level while the subjects read the moral sentences than either of the two other kinds of sentences. So this part lit up. The medial orbitofrontal cortex. And so he proposes that the medial orbitofrontal cortex must play some unique role in moral reasoning. And Phineas Gage might prove him right. 1848, Phineas Gage was a well-liked foreman of a railroad crew. A dynamite accident happens, and there's those big bars they use to make railroads to move the track and everything else. One of those bars was next to the dynamite and went straight through his head. Right through his eye. Right through the medial orbitofrontal cortex. You should look this guy up. He's an interesting dude. So he survives. He not only survives, he has speech, motion, intelligence, all that. I mean, it goes right through the brain. Sorry. I'm sorry, Catherine. It's getting too graphic. He survives. Speech, motion, intelligence, but according to friends and family, he was no longer Phineas Gage. Obstinate, irresponsible, capricious. He was unable to keep his job, and later he spent 7 years as an exhibit in a traveling circus. Things we do to the people who aren't like us. Sometime remind me to tell you about Ishi in Northern California. Modern patients with similar brain damage show the same kinds of deficits. They're obscene, irreverent, uninhibited, and they show disastrous judgment both personally and professionally. Wait, that's me. Okay. So, as you might imagine, this is contested. This is usually what happens when science tries to reduce something to one thing. By the way, mythology does the same thing. It tries not to one thing, but it tries to reduce the world to something manageable. So, of course, and this is the beauty and the frustration of the scientific method, and that's that another researcher found a different conclusion. Is that, in fact, when moral reasoning is happening, all parts of the brain are lit up. And of course, moral reasoning is not going to be located in a particular part of the brain. It's a human thing. It's going to involve emotion. Not just chemicals and not just emotions produced by chemicals. It's going to involve the world around us and how we've incorporated that into ourselves. All right. So, for us tonight, here's what I think brings it home for us. What's the relationship between morality and wisdom? This is what we're about here. We're the University of Philosophical Research, and I often have to explain that. And frankly, I don't never seen the phrase anywhere but here. But I know what Manly Hall meant when he created the Philosophical Research Society. He meant philosophy in its etymological sense as the love of wisdom. Philos Sophia, the love of wisdom. What's the relationship between being a moral person and being a wise person? I find that really interesting. And that applies directly to this series in how we become who we are and the stages along our life's way. So, for example, if you do take an ethics course, and I hope you do, you're going to hear about 3 types of ethical theories, right? Mario, have you taken an ethics course yet?
Yeah, I just took the final on it, like, I don't know how many hours ago.
Oh,
6
good.
hours ago.
Come up and talk about it.
Okay.
So, deontology, do you remember that?
Yeah,
What's that mean in Greek?
I have no idea.
Okay, sorry. It's about duty.
Yeah.
It's about following a law simply because it's the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. Fair?
Yeah.
What is teleology or consequentialism, did you say?
Yeah, like the altruism versus like consequentialism.
Yeah.
So, doing things for, the sake of how it's going to affect you later on, right? Or consequences, right?
Yeah, or in a larger way, how it's going to affect society.
Yeah.
Most famously articulated by Jeremy Bentham as the greatest good for the greatest number. So that's teleology or consequentialism, from the Greek word that simply, telos, which simply means end or goal. So what's the ultimate goal in your decision making, right? Are you going to save Homer Simpson? We should put Bart in there. Bart would just kill everything. Are you going to save Homer Simpson or Family Guy? Well, that's an easy answer in consequentialism. The greatest good for the greatest number, we're going to save the most people. But there's also virtue ethics. I don't know if you got into this, Aristotelian virtue ethics. Yeah.
Golden mean.
Yeah, golden mean, exactly. Aristotle, where a virtuous act is one done by a virtuous person. You see, so there's this kind of Kantian kind of duty, sense of duty. Again, it's a system outside, right? Because either you're following God or you're following some categorical imperative, as Kant put it. It's outside of you. Or you're following consequentialism and teleology, you're counting. Bentham actually created this notion, I forget what he called it, but it was basically units of ethics. So if you did X and Y and Z in this particular situation, you got 17 ethic points. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? What are you going to do with the number? I mean, anyway, don't get me started. But frankly, to be honest, most of us are consequentialists. We're teleological in our ethics. We count. Weigh and count and balance. Or, again, that's outside of you. Or you can let your ethical reasoning come from within you. Virtue ethics. Much like moral reasoning versus wisdom. Kierkegaard, I've already mentioned. The aesthetic, where you function according to pleasure. You seek pleasure and revel in it. Then you move to the ethical, well, not then. For Kierkegaard, you're kind of always in all 3. But there's the ethical. Remember the judge who speaks in his works. You're like, no, we should just do this because it's right. It's the right thing to do. But then eventually, if you're going to follow God, says Kierkegaard, you must get to the religious. You must take the leap of faith away from the ethical. And in fact, Kierkegaard, who loves to play with language, called it the teleological suspension of the ethical. And his famous example, in case you weren't here for our discussion of it, is Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. To follow God, he must be willing to commit murder of his son that holds the promise of the great nation. That's how radical following God is for Kierkegaard. We mentioned Sermon on the Mount briefly with Carl Jung, and we had a whole class, an evening on the Sermon on the Sermon on the Mount. Remember Jesus speaking in the sermon, at the Sermon on the Mount. He says, this is great moral staging he does, where he says, you know, you've heard it said that you shouldn't commit murder. I say, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder in your heart. There. You've said, you've heard it written, or seen it written, that you should not commit adultery. I say that if you lust after someone in your heart, you've committed adultery already. You're laughing at that? Okay, we should talk later. And remember, it's right after that where he says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Because it's better to go around without a right hand than to commit these sins. And he ends the Sermon on the Mount with, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Yeah? Did I tell you the story of when I spoke in chapel once? Remind me to tell you that story sometime. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. What does this mean? Well, I think what it means is we've got to get beyond do not, thou shalt not, thou shalt. Wisdom is beyond that. Perfection is beyond that. That's the message of the Sermon on the Mount. I get it. Because I can't be perfect as my Father in heaven is perfect. But maybe I can be wise. Right? So there's always, for wisdom, I think it's always this other thing, right, that doesn't exist as a component of the system. It exists without and within the system. That's what wisdom is, I think. Dao De Jing, right? He who says does not know. He who knows, he who knows does not say. All right, where do we go from there? Just shut up? Except the way is bigger than saying and knowing. There's this transcendent element. For me, that's wisdom. Simone de Beauvoir, the great existentialist, who was challenged to create an ethics of existentialism. And she said, no problem. Here's a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. And she said, how can you not create an ethical system when you're thrown into an absurd world, alone and with no meaning? You must make your meaning. And your meaning is your ethics. And it's an ethics of ambiguity. Because it's you, an absurd creature, living in an absurd world. But you must live. And you must be in the world. The ethics of ambiguity. And of course, the great Buddhist tradition of wisdom and compassion. There it is, right? So it's not just wisdom. It's not just knowing things. It's acting on things. It's the ethical as well as the abstract, as well as the knowledge, as well as wisdom. Wisdom, and Manly Hall taught this too, that wisdom cannot be inert. It cannot just sit there. It has to be in the world. It has to do something. And so while wisdom, I think, transcends ethics, it also